A black old man driving a car that nice. There's something shady going on. The officer's words came out less like a question and more like a verdict, delivered without evidence. He didn't ask for papers. He didn't need a reason. For him, skin color was reason enough. But what he didn't know was this. The elderly man he was harassing was a justice of the Supreme Court, a man who had once signed into law the very statutes the officer was now bending. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This was justice turning to stare down the man who claimed to serve it. What state do you live in? Could this happen there? The morning wind in Monroe always cut across the streets as if it didn't have the patience to wait for a new day to begin. The shops remained shuttered, their hand-painted signs faded with dust, and a few small trucks roared by like they were tearing apart the last shreds of quiet in a southern town once advertised as where law walks hand in hand with trust. That old slogan still hung on the welcome sign at the edge of town, but no one bothered to read it anymore. Rick Delroy drove the new patrol car, radio on but muted, his fingers tapping on the steering wheel as if waiting for a note out of sync from the road, something his mind would label as non-compliant. For Rick, there was no need for a red light run, no need for speeding, no strange smell from the exhaust, no offbeat signal from the database system, just a faint feeling. A slight irregularity in how a car moved was enough for him to flip on the light. He didn't call it profiling, he called it professional instinct. The old Lincoln appeared as if it wanted no attention. Matte black, untinted windows, no postal stickers, a state plate with chipped edges. The car didn't look old in a dilapidated way, but in a way that said it had once been cared for and then left to age untouched. It moved slowly, steadily, not swerving, not erratic, committing no offense a law could pin down. And yet it unsettled Rick. He turned the wheel, merged into the lane behind it. Not too close, not too far, like a hunter who'd caught the scent but hadn't yet found the wind. In the rearview mirror, he saw the driver, an elderly black man wearing a gray felt hat, a brown buttoned-up vest, sitting upright as if heading to a wedding, black gloves on his hands, gently tapping the wheel, eyes forward, not glancing at the mirror. Rick muttered under his breath, "Fancy car, but doesn't look wealthy. That's suspicious." He turned on the red and blue lights. The Lincoln pulled over instantly, as if there was nothing to consider. No argument, no evasion, but that calmness, that unnerving calmness, irritated Rick. He stepped out, hand resting loosely on his holster. Not out of fear, but habit. A habit formed through hundreds of stops involving those deemed non-conforming, which in his mind meant anyone who didn't act like someone with something to lose. The old man rolled down the window slowly, with no sound of panic, no darting glances, just a steady gaze, not confrontational, not submissive, but enough to make Rick feel like he was the one being seen through. "Good morning," Rick said in a tone neither friendly nor hostile, the kind of tone someone uses when they've just walked into a room but aren't ready to talk. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" The old man tilted his head slightly. He didn't smile, he didn't resist. "I suppose you have your reasons? And I suppose I shouldn't presume to guess?" Rick frowned. The answer wasn't confrontational, but it wasn't submissive either. It was like splashing cold water on an old mirror. No cracks, no shatter, but a foggy smear left behind in the light. "Where are you headed?" Rick asked, this time louder, as if trying to reclaim control through volume. "I'm going to a farewell," the old man replied, eyes still fixed on the road. "Who passed?" Rick asked, but not out of care. The old man paused for a moment, then answered, "A piece of history." Rick squinted. That wasn't a standard response. It didn't fit the template, it held no legal weight, but it gave him no grounds to act. He returned to his cruiser, punched the license plate into the system, everything came back clean. He glanced into the mirror again. The old man sat still, upright, unmoving. Rick stepped back out and requested ID. The man handed over a black leather wallet, slim, worn, unremarkable, and retrieved a government ID with a faded silver seal, hard to read. Rick turned it over, inspecting the emblem. "Never seen this before. Nice forgery," he said, half joking, half probing. The old man didn't argue. He simply nodded and said, "If you think it's fake, call it in." Rick hadn't expected that. He was hoping for some spark, some escalation to justify going tactical, but nothing. The man remained courteous, calm, unafraid, and unprovoked. That made Rick feel like he was punching at a curtain. No pain, but no sense of triumph either. Something uneasy stirred in his gut. "Where are you from?" "I live here." "Since when?" "Since before you were born." There was no insult in that reply, but it made Rick look up. The old man showed no bitterness, no scorn, yet every word he spoke landed like a period, giving Rick no space to steer the exchange his way. "I'm going to ask you to open the trunk," Rick said. "For what reason?" "I suspect there's something unusual. Would you mind putting that suspicion in writing? I haven't written up a report yet." "So you're checking me based on a feeling?" Rick exhaled sharply, stepped back half a stride. He wasn't being resisted, but he also wasn't in control. The man before him wasn't acting like someone afraid of being investigated, or like someone who had nothing left to prove. He looked into the rearview mirror once more, then returned to the cruiser and called dispatch to run the ID. When prompted for the name, he leaned in and muttered, "Franklin? Franklin O. Gaines?" The voice on the other end paused for 3 seconds. Rick tapped the console lightly. "Hello? Can you hear me?" The reply came low and firm. "Are you referring to Franklin Othell Gaines?" I guess so. That's what it says. Hold the line." Rick sat upright. For the first time that morning, his fingers stopped tapping the steering wheel. The silence on the line didn't last long, but it lasted just long enough to stir a feeling Rick wasn't used to confronting. Legitimate uncertainty. Not the kind that arises in complex situations, but the kind that sets in when the puzzle pieces begin to fall into place in ways you didn't want them to. When the line reconnected, the voice on the other end had changed. No longer the familiar dispatch clerk. Someone else, deeper, more refined, but colder, asked plainly, "Are you requesting verification for Franklin Othell Gaines?" Rick nodded, though no one could see. "Yes, he's the one I'm stopping." A short beat, then only the sound of typing keys. No response, no confirmation, not even a question. Just a silence that gradually thickened into pressure on Rick's spine like a wordless warning. Rick ended the call, not because things were resolved, but because he felt the need to reassert control directly. He stepped out of the vehicle, his thick-soled boots unexpectedly loud on the empty road. The sky had brightened a few degrees, but the air around the Lincoln felt denser. The old man still sat there, hands resting properly on the wheel, eyes forward, unmoving, not breathing heavily, as if holding the form of a statue that never needed recognition. Rick stopped by the window, slowly pulled the government ID from his pocket, and held it up, but not fully extended. His thumb pressed against the edge of the card, as if testing the sharpness of authority rather than the authenticity of the document. "Are you sure this is legitimate?" Rick asked, part threat, part test. "I gave you what I have. Whether or not you believe it, that's your right," the old man replied, his voice light like someone closing a book they've read too many times. It wasn't the content of the reply that threw Rick off. It was the manner. No one spoke to him like that without fear. No one declined to answer like that without getting an inspection order shoved in their face. But this time, something held him back. His hand still held the card, but his thumb drew back as if it had touched some invisible dust. He stepped back half a pace, then said this time with steel, "I'm asking you to step out of the vehicle." The old man turned to face him, his eyes direct, not confrontational, but unyielding. "Under what regulation?" "State law enforcement policy. I have the right to request exit from the vehicle if I have reasonable suspicion." "And what is that suspicion?" Rick hesitated. He had no solid reason, just a feeling. Unusual behavior? He said, clinging to it like a life raft in a flood. You think my behavior is unusual because I don't look you in the eye? Because you're not cooperating. I am cooperating. But I don't submit unless it's necessary. Every word the old man spoke carried no scent of defiance, but tasted of a kind of experience Rick couldn't fracture. The kind that made men like him feel out of control simply because they could no longer control their sense of authority. Rick stiffened. He suddenly felt his responses unravel, like someone turning a lock, unsure if they're using a key or forcing it open. He stepped back, exhaled hard, then barked, "Open the trunk." The old man didn't answer immediately. He unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the door, stood up, posture straight, unhurried. "I'll open it, but if you find nothing, what will you do next?" Rick clenched his fists. He had no answer. Finding nothing, that was the scenario he hadn't rehearsed for. He was trained to detect faults, not to face someone faultless who still felt threatening. The old man walked to the rear, pulled a key from his inner pocket, the kind with worn silver edges from age, and inserted it into the lock. Rick took a half step back, hand instinctively returning to his holster. The trunk opened. Inside was a bouquet of white flowers, wrapped in brown paper, an old fedora carefully folded, and a small wooden box engraved with the name E. L. Gaines. The old man bent down, gently brushed the lid of the box, then turned back. "What do you want to check? This is all I carry. I have no weapons. I hide nothing in the car. I only carry a memory." Rick had no response. Nothing in the trunk was suspicious, but nothing was ordinary either, and it was that simplicity, that refusal to be twisted into wrongdoing, that left him frozen, unsure of what to do next. The old man looked at him, no longer questioning, challenging. Just a look. Sad. Not for Rick, but for a whole generation of young men who believed that with a badge came the right to name others however they pleased. "You're doing your job, I understand, but that job doesn't give you the right to misread who I am." Rick was speechless. He'd been intimidated, subdued, and overpowered, but he had never been made to feel so out of place. Not by violence or resistance, but by a man's gaze and voice, as if he were acting out a play whose audience already knew the script. He turned away. For a fleeting moment, Rick Delroy, the man who once gripped the law as firmly as he gripped his weapon, found himself with no more questions to ask, and no authority left to impose. All that remained was the badge, and a silence between two men that no uniform could ever bridge. Rick stood there, staring into the open trunk, as if he were looking at a canvas whose brush strokes he couldn't decipher. The items inside were too simple to arouse suspicion, yet too solemn to ignore. He said nothing, asked for nothing more, but he didn't leave, as if retreating now would turn everything that had just happened into a public defeat, one for which no justification could cover. And in that taut silence, like an old string about to snap, the old man gently closed the trunk, as though folding shut a mournful chapter of a long-read book. When he turned to face Rick, he didn't speak another word. He simply nodded. A nod not of submission, not of surrender, but as if to acknowledge a truth, that some things don't need to be resisted, but must never be accepted. That nod sent a chill through Rick, not from fear, but from the fact that he couldn't interpret it. He was used to shifty glances, stammered explanations, cries of innocence. What he faced now was a full, unflinching presence that needed no words. He tried to find a crevice of doubt to grip, some small flaw to redirect his logic, but all he saw was an older man standing upright, eyes level, speech measured, movements slow, and none of that amounted to anything suspicious. It amounted to a person whose dignity didn't stem from a title, but from the sheer absence of anything to prove. Rick flipped the government ID again. Not to find fault this time, but to stall, to understand. The badge had silver edges, faded at the corners, clearly worn by years. He tried to read every line closely. Judicial authorization. followed by a faint print. Franklin O. Gaines, appointed under Constitutional Article 4. Rick's eyes narrowed, his lips tightened. He had seen that phrasing on television, in political exposés, but never held it in his hands. And certainly never seen it presented by someone he had pulled over for looking out of place. The old man noticed the shift in Rick's expression. Not a rise, not a retreat, just a shift. And that was enough for him to step forward, retrieving the ID between two fingers. No rush, no force. Rick let it go. But the gesture didn't feel like returning a document to a civilian. It felt like withdrawing from a courtroom he had unknowingly entered as the defendant. "May I ask again?" Rick said, his voice now lower, slower. "Where can this badge be verified?" The old man looked him straight in the eye and replied, "Through a lifetime, through a conscience, and if you need something more, call the state Supreme Court." His voice was calm but sharp, like a straight razor gliding quietly across the neck of a suspicion. Rick didn't call. He knew there was no need, because every instinct in him was flashing red, not out of fear of the old man, but because the man wasn't afraid of him, and because there was nothing the man stood to lose. Rick didn't know why, but his throat felt dry. Sweat began to gather along the back of his shirt, not from heat, but from something he couldn't define. The feeling of being tested without knowing what the test was. The terms he once wielded to control others, like law enforcement, reasonable suspicion, procedural compliance, suddenly felt hollow in the presence of someone who neither denied nor conceded, who simply stood there as a presence that cracked the definitions Rick had lived by. While Rick was still fumbling for a way out, a woman walking by, holding a shopping bag, stopped when she recognized the old man. She didn't call his name, just widened her eyes, then slowly stepped back, nestling herself along the edge of the sidewalk, hands clenched as if witnessing something that should not have happened. She didn't speak to Rick, but her eyes locked onto him, waiting for one final misstep, one more inch too far that would make this irredeemable. Rick noticed her, and in that moment he no longer felt like a police officer. He felt like a man in uniform standing before another man, one whom he no longer had the right to question, but lacked the courage to apologize to. "Do you need me to escort you to your destination?" Rick asked, reaching for a thread of dignity. The old man shook his head, softly as breath. "No need. The road I walk was never meant for those who need escorting." The words held no hidden sting, but in Rick's ears they landed like a verdict, lighter than paper, yet heavier than any statute he had studied. A refusal without insult, but one that made the listener feel they had been removed from the game, with no seat left to return to. Rick stood frozen as the old man stepped back into his car, shut the door, adjusted his rearview mirror, then calmly started the engine. The Lincoln rolled away as before, slow, steady, without a sound, without smoke, but left behind a long silence trailing its rear bumper like an unsigned indictment. When the car disappeared behind the red brick buildings down the street, Rick lowered his head, not from guilt, not quite from remorse, but because he knew the stop no longer belonged to him. It had slipped from his grasp the moment the old man nodded, a nod that didn't plead, didn't protest, but quietly redrew the line between dignity and power. And Rick, in all his years wearing the badge, had never found himself on the other side of that line. The Lincoln was gone, but its shadow lingered on the road like a hairline crack invisible to the eye, until someone stepped on it and felt the jolt in their stride. Rick stood in the middle of the street, neither moving forward nor turning back. The wind slipped through the seams of his uniform, unusually cold for the morning temperature. He didn't know how long he had been standing there. All he knew was that when he finally returned to his patrol car, the imprint of his grip still marked his palm from clutching a badge that was no longer there. He started the engine by rote, but didn't drive off. His instincts told him something was unfinished. and what's unfinished cannot be left behind. Not because of the law, but because of ego. The kind of wound a uniform can't cover if it's hit in the right place. Rick glanced up at the radio screen, then reached to press the button to call dispatch. Though he didn't say it aloud, the name he was about to type in, Franklin O. Gaines, was no longer for verification. It was to affirm that the man he had just stopped was the one he had assumed could never appear in a place like this. He needed more information. He needed something to explain why someone who had once graced the front page of the State Law Review could be pulled over in the middle of the street like a suspect. And deeper still, he needed a reason not to feel like he had just offended something sacred he hadn't even begun to understand. In the state's database, the name Franklin O. Gaines surfaced instantly, along with a portrait, title, appointment date, footage from federal judicial conferences, and most striking of all, a video from over 20 years ago. In it, the judge gave a speech during a racial justice ceremony, speaking about the right to be suspected less because you've lived more decently, not from fear, but from the sense that he had just unknowingly spat on a last will written in blood, not the blood of a single man, but of an entire generation. He turned off the screen but didn't look away. Something kept pulling him back, wouldn't let him settle. He stepped out of the car again, back onto the street. This time, there were no passing cars, no watching eyes. But that didn't comfort him, because silence no longer meant safety. It meant no witnesses. And it's in moments like these, when no one is watching, that men most easily slide off the edge of their moral balance. Rick returned to the trunk that had already been closed. There was nothing left to inspect. But he stood there anyway, as if hoping to find some overlooked clue, a reason, a slip-up, a gap. But all that remained was the wooden box, the bouquet, the folded fedora, items too clean to be dangerous, too real to be fabricated. Somewhere inside him, a voice began to rise. Not from logic, but from that darker chamber of self. A man like him. Where's he going that needs so much ceremony? Or is he just showing off? This kind of thing. I've seen it before. He returned to the car and turned on the radio. This time, he didn't wait to be called. He spoke first. I just handled a vehicle stop. Suspicion was unclear. The individual showed signs of non-cooperation, avoided direct answers, and used evasive language. Possible abuse of status to avoid procedure. His voice was steady, but each word carried a compression he hadn't yet digested. Name? Came the reply. Rick answered immediately. Franklin Othell Gaines. There was a pause. Then the voice turned dry. Did you just say the individual was Justice Franklin O. Gaines? Rick didn't respond directly. I'm questioning whether he used his position to sidestep standard inspection. If he'd been an ordinary citizen, I would have requested a full trunk search, but he played that arrogant silence routine. He scoffed at his own words, even though no one was listening. The kind of scoff men make when they need to convince themselves they're still right, even when they know they aren't. But then came a question from the other end. Not loud, but like a punch to the chest. Are you sure you're reporting a violation, or just trying to rationalize a bruised ego? Rick didn't answer. He just shut off the radio. His hand gripped the steering wheel, fingernails pressing into the synthetic leather. That was when the phrases began to surface. Ones he had heard before but never paid attention to. Occupational pride, reflex response to a loss of control, powerlessness masked as legal reasoning. He had always thought those were conference room theories, not field tools. But now, with no one to blame and no action left to justify his protocol, he saw clearly what this traffic stop had become. No longer a routine check, it had turned into an uneven confrontation between arrogance learned through power and the calm of a man long used to watching systems crumble under their weight. And that was when he realized he was never the one asking the questions. He never had been. Rick stood beside his patrol car like a man who just stepped out of an exam without knowing where he went wrong. The words he'd spoken moments ago, that the old man displayed an attitude, that he used his position, were nothing more than desperate attempts to soothe a shaken ego, like tossing sand into the wind and pretending it meant steering direction. But no one responded. Not a word of agreement. No one stepped forward to back him up. And in that emptiness, the first voice rose, not from the radio, not from memory, but from the sidewalk, where a woman holding a grocery bag had stopped cold, as if she just witnessed something that didn't belong to the routine of daily life. She stood there silently at first, eyes wide, lips trembling. Then she blurted out, unable to contain it, "Oh, God! That's him." Rick turned, his brow furrowing immediately. He didn't like interruptions, especially in moments where he hadn't yet figured out how to spin the narrative to his advantage. He stepped forward, voice sharp. "You know him?" The woman didn't answer right away. She looked at Rick with a gaze that was part astonishment, part warning. "You don't know who he is?" she asked, but didn't wait for a reply. "He's the one who signed the release for my brother, when everyone thought the boy deserved punishment. He saw something in him that no one else in that courtroom dared to see. And now, you're stopping him?" Rick froze. He'd faced anger before, threats, defiance, but never disappointment, especially not from someone with no personal stake. This kind of disappointment didn't shout, didn't curse, but it carried the weight of 100 lived stories, none of which he could dismiss. "Please step back, this is official duty," Rick said. But his voice had dropped, no longer the firm command of an officer, but a soft, fading plea for some dignity, still slipping from his shoulder. The woman didn't move. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed toward the car. "Do you know how many political positions he turned down, just to hold one seat? A judge's bench, not for power but for responsibility." Rick stayed quiet. Words like those couldn't be countered with enforcement rhetoric. Every sentence was a stone flipping over a part of him, where assumptions were cemented by skin color, attire, and eyes that didn't waver. Then, across the street, a young man on a bicycle had also stopped. He parked near a light pole, pulled out his phone, and began recording. Not Rick, but the old man. As if afraid that this moment, the moment of him quietly opening his car door, neither resisting nor defending, might vanish without proof it ever happened. Rick stepped forward, trying to reclaim control by raising a hand in front of the lens. "No filming. This is an active police situation." The young man looked up, not confrontational, but clear. "I'm not filming you. I'm filming dignity. Because some people go a lifetime without seeing it. From someone who didn't even need to be calm." Rick didn't respond. He just walked slowly back to his car, each step heavier, as if burdened with an invisible indictment. He had studied the concept of loss of public image control in training seminars, but he'd never thought it would come from the quiet presence of someone who did nothing, just stood there, watched, and waited for others to realize they'd just broken something irreparable. A small child passed by with their mother. The child looked up at the old man and asked, "Mom, why did they stop him?" The mother didn't answer. She just turned and looked at Rick. Not with anger, not with hate, just a shake of the head. And that shake was louder than 1,000 screams. Rick felt himself pulled into a deep hollow where everything he believed, that as long as he followed procedure justice would follow, was beginning to unravel beneath his feet. On social media, the young man's footage had already begun to spread. The first captions appeared, stopped by police, not for any wrongdoing, but because his presence didn't match someone else's assumptions. Rick didn't know it right away, but he felt the shift in the eyes around him. They were no longer a gaze of citizens toward law enforcement. They were the gaze of people waiting for an explanation, one that should never have been needed in a place called public. And while Rick still didn't know how to gather the shards of dignity that had fallen, the old man, Franklin O. Gaines, simply opened his car door stepped in, unhurried, unbothered. Before shutting the door, he turned, his eyes passing over Rick one final time, not with blame, not with resentment, but like someone looking at a wound too deep to be bandaged with words. Rick turned away, not to avoid him, but because he knew, for the first time, he had been defeated, not by weapons, not by superior authority, but by the composure of a man who didn't raise his voice, yet left everyone else in silence. The young man with the worn-out phone had clipped together the first video, just 45 seconds long. No music, no effects. Just the image of an elderly black man stepping out of a Lincoln, opening the trunk, his hand trembling as he placed a bouquet of white flowers on the lid, then turning to face the officer whose eyes still held suspicion. The old man's face showed no anger, but his eyes, those eyes that neither lowered nor looked away, made nearly 200,000 viewers in the first 2 hours stop for a few seconds after watching, as if they were being seen through the screen. No one spoke at first, but soon the comments started rolling in. Lines, then paragraphs, then waves of opinion swelling into a storm with no epicenter, yet strong enough to shred any veneer labeled professional oversight. One person wrote, "I don't know who he is, but the way he stayed silent made me ashamed for thinking this wasn't my problem." Another commented, "This isn't just racism anymore. This is an insult to justice disguised as indifference." But the most powerful came from a verified account saying only, "I served under him in the military. If it weren't for Judge Gaines, I would have died in the 1991 counter-ambush. And today, I saw him stop like a suspect. I will not forgive that." Rick didn't yet know about that comment, but he started to feel the shift on the street. A car pulled up on the opposite side. The driver, a middle-aged woman in hospital scrubs, rolled down her window and shouted, "If a cop doesn't know who they're dealing with, they shouldn't wear the uniform." Rick turned away, but her voice rose again, louder. "I'm not saying that because he's a judge. I'm saying that because no one deserves to be treated like that, even if he were just an old man going to a funeral." Every word was like a broom sweeping dust off the badge on Rick's chest. Something he once thought was a symbol of justice, now turning into evidence of delusion. A few blocks down, at a street corner, a group of students huddled around a phone discussing the clip. A young woman in a hoodie, holding a lukewarm coffee, asked her friend, "What do you think they'll do about this?" The friend didn't answer immediately. After a pause, they replied, "I don't know. But I know this. I won't look at a traffic stop the same way again." That's where change begins, with sentences like that, not in courtrooms, not through verdicts, but in everyday life, where justice isn't defined by law, but by whether people feel they're treated with dignity. That same afternoon, a short local news broadcast went live. A traffic stop is gaining attention on social media. The man stopped by the police was Judge Franklin O. Gaines, a key figure in racial justice rulings over the past 3 decades. There has been no official comment from the police department. The segment lasted only 90 seconds, but it lifted the lid off a pressure chamber that had waited far too long to release. Rick sat in his cruiser, eyes fixed on the steering wheel, his mind spinning between the sensation of exposure and abandonment. No calls, no texts, no directives from higher-ups, just the ding of his phone. A message from his wife, only 2 words, "You okay?" But Rick didn't answer, because for the first time in his life as a police officer, he wasn't sure okay applied to who he was anymore. Elsewhere in the city, in a small diner on the corner of Monroe, an older man, silver hair, broad shoulders, wearing a veteran's jacket, sat eating soup when the video played on a wall-mount TV. He put down his spoon without a word. His eyes followed every movement of the man in the clip. When the screen shifted to commercials, he turned to the server nearby. "Bring me the check. I need to go see him." The server blinked. "You know the man in the video?" The veteran nodded. "I was the last man he ever spared. Now, it's my turn to say thank you." The receipt at the diner hadn't even finished printing when the server's phone buzzed with a string of unfamiliar messages, all linked to the now viral clip titled "Judge Gaines Pulled Over." Across the city, Rick still hadn't left the spot where it all began. He clung to the semblance of duty, but inside, all that remained was a shapeless resistance between self-preservation and the fear of exposure. At that moment, Monroe Police Department's systems began registering a flood of unusual activity. Unauthorized access attempts to the state's judicial database. Not from within, but from independent journalists, watchdog organizations, and worst of all, the 8th Federal Judicial Circuit Office. The question wasn't who was searching Judge Gaines, but why someone pulled over during a routine stop, had federal coordination files attached to 48 tiers of special jurisdiction. Rick's superior, Lieutenant Hank Ellis, received an emergency alert from the internal system, flagged, "Urgent, verify and respond to public image concerns involving Judge Franklin Othell Gaines." The email didn't sound panic, but every word was a blade carving into the last layer of defense within a system far too used to handling crises by waiting them out. Ellis called Rick. The phone rang twice. On the third, Rick answered, his voice dry like burned paper. "This is Rick." Ellis didn't waste time. "You just pulled over a living symbol of this state's legal system. And you did it like someone who had no idea what he was doing." Rick said nothing. Ellis continued, "I'm not here for your explanation. I want you off that street. No one told you to find fault. No one told you to block cameras. But now I'm telling you, step back. 'Cause the name you just stopped isn't a person. It's a history no administrative report can scrub." Rick didn't answer. He gripped the phone so tightly that his fingers turned pale. He didn't know what to say, because that name had swallowed every possible justification. Franklin O. Gaines. That name was now a dangerous syllable, not because he threatened anyone, but because every time it was spoken, a new crack formed in the public trust toward law enforcement. Inside the precinct, officers whispered to one another, "Rick stopped the right man at the wrong time." But even that was too soft, because no one stops a judge, especially not Judge Gaines, and walks away from the storm untouched. On national television, the second round of news segments aired. The incident is now drawing attention beyond state lines. The Justice Department has confirmed that the man stopped was Franklin Othell Gaines, one of the few sitting Supreme Court justices who helped draft the 2003 Civil Rights Reform Act. A commentator typed each word deliberately. No one should be treated like a suspect for not matching a traffic cop's expectation. But what's more troubling, the system is still struggling to recognize the very people it once vowed to honor. Back at the Monroe precinct, emergency briefings were held behind closed doors. No press, no cameras, just a whiteboard with one red-marked directive. Media script. Misinterpreted incident. No confirmation, no rebuttal, no apology. But as soon as those words were spoken, a senior officer stood up and growled, "No apology? I didn't fight in Iraq just to come home and watch the man I respect most treated like a criminal with a record." The room went silent. No one objected, but no one openly agreed either. Because Gaines's name had already transcended the report, it had become a living mirror, reflecting whether the system truly understood the values it once swore to uphold. His name began appearing in high school classrooms not because of his title, but because of that video, not even a full minute long. A civics teacher played the clip, then asked, "What is justice if even its representatives are doubted?" No one answered. But a student stood up and said, "The way he looked at that cop, it felt like the gaze of a man who once saved a foundation, and now sees that same foundation forgetting his name." The class didn't clap. They didn't have to. Truth doesn't need applause. Rick sat alone in his car, eyes fixed on the badge on his chest as if waiting for it to speak in his defense. But it said nothing, and for the first time he realized the silence of a symbol can be more terrifying than 1,000 accusations. No one mentioned his name anymore. No texts asking, "Are you okay?" Every call now pivoted toward another name. A name that needed no introduction, no defense, but was being whispered everywhere now. Like a curse upon those who once believed justice was a privilege, not a reminder. Judge Gaines's name was no longer a footnote beneath a screen. It had slipped from social media into mainstream press, then from local news segments to the front pages of national newspapers. But unlike other sensationalized stories, this time there were no shouts, no stages set. The story spread by quietly pressing against the corners of forgotten conscience, where people who once believed they had nothing to do with any of this suddenly realized. His name wasn't something to know, it was something you no longer had the right not to know. Rick received the internal message just after 10 the next morning. A link with no title, no commentary, just a short code. Internal, eyes only, priority 1. He clicked it. The screen opened to a compilation video from multiple sources, the original clip, street camera angles, the bystander woman's statement, the veteran's comment, a 60-second news flash from the Washington Post, and closing with a slow-motion shot, Judge Gaines standing by his open trunk, hand resting on the bouquet of white flowers, eyes not focused on anyone in particular, but somehow making everyone feel seen. Below the video was a single line, bolded, no attribution. The moment you no longer have the right not to know. Rick shut off the screen. In his head, every excuse that once served as a shield collapsed like silent dominoes. I didn't know who he was. That sentence, once offered to deflect error, was now a kind of unwritten indictment. Not knowing meant choosing not to learn. Not learning means unknowingly permitting yourself to repeat the same mistake. Government agencies remained silent, but civil society did not. The Coalition for Judicial Fairness issued a statement. We are not demanding dismissal. We are demanding remembrance. It wasn't punitive, but it sent a deeper chill through every level of authority than any formal petition, because it wasn't calling for action, it was calling for accountability to exist. And once responsibility has been named, no one can pretend that. That same afternoon, at a judicial reform symposium in Boston, when asked about the Monroe incident, Professor Lawrence Binham, who had co-authored legislative drafts with Judge Gaines, said just one sentence: "Negligence is no longer innocent when the one it harms is the very person who taught us what justice means." That line was quoted in dozens of articles, podcasts, and evening broadcasts. No one argued. No one dared to spin it, because this wasn't about a cop and a citizen anymore. It was about an entire system seeing its reflection in the failure of one man, not for breaking the law, but for the absence of awareness. At a Southern law school, students were assigned an essay. If you were Officer Rick Delroy, what would you have done differently? A first-year student wrote, "I would have asked, 'What's your name?' Not for the report, but to remind myself that names are not just words on paper. They are histories every person carries with them." The essay received a perfect score and was published publicly, serving as a quiet message to the next generation being trained for the future of justice. That justice doesn't begin with authority. It begins with how you look at someone and recognize they carry a name that deserves to be known properly. Rick didn't write anything. He had no more words, only the sound of the internal office phone ringing, a rhythmic knock against the ceiling of his thoughts. He was called back to the station, not for interrogation, but for a media narrative alignment meeting, a room where everyone spoke in the same tone, not accusing, but not defending either. Lieutenant Ellis was the only one who spoke differently. "I used to believe the system could shield everything as long as we followed the process," he said, looking Rick in the eye, then lowering his voice. "But Gaines didn't need the process. He is the standard we should measure ourselves against to remember why we do this work." The meeting ended without a conclusion. Rick stepped into the hallway, saw the nameplate still on the office door. Lieutenant Rick Delroy, Traffic Enforcement Unit, but when he looked at it, he didn't see himself. Not because the name was wrong, but because everything attached to that name had been drained of energy like a wire that no longer carried current. He remembered Gaines' eyes, when he opened the trunk, when he waited, when he said nothing but made others feel smaller just by being, and Rick knew. At that moment, the name Gaines carried was no longer just his own. It had become a mirror society that was beginning to look into, asking itself, why didn't we see it sooner? The nameplate reading Lieutenant Rick Delroy still hung on the office door when he gently pushed it open, but no one looked up as he entered. No raised brows, not a single customary nod. The room reeked of stale coffee and printer toner, but it was the silence that smothered Rick, thick and unrelenting, making it hard to breathe. He moved down the hall toward the emergency meeting room typically used when the town faced a major incident, but this time there was no accident. Only a name he had uttered less than 24 hours ago. A name is now quietly smoldering at the heart of every major headline in the country. Lieutenant Hank Ellis sat at the head of the table, holding a glass of water like he was trying not to crush something fragile between his fingers. He didn't motion for Rick to sit, didn't ask him to stand either. He just stared, silent, like someone counting breaths before delivering a sentence that couldn't be taken back. Finally, he set the glass down, pulled a thin folder from beneath the table, and slid it toward Rick. He said, his tone wasn't loud or soft, but there was a weight underneath it that made Rick move, as if gravity no longer belonged to him. Rick sat and opened the folder. It wasn't an internal report. It wasn't his statement. It was a copy of an emergency contact log from the State Executive Coordination Office. At the top was a raised seal, beneath it all caps, Priority Call, Agent Code Chairman State Judice Committee. Rick didn't blink. He flipped to the next page. A transcript of the call read, Monroe Police Department has stopped Franklin Othell Gaines, no traffic infraction noted, no public response from the subject. However, visual documentation has spread. Immediate directives are required from the state level before the situation escalates into a legal and moral crisis. Ellis folded his arms, leaning forward slightly. Do you know this is the first time in 20 years we've received a direct request from the chair of the State Judiciary Committee? Rick nodded, but his throat was dry. He knew, and he knew what that meant. Not that he was being investigated, but that he was now under a lens where no explanation would come fast enough. Ellis exhaled. I don't need you to say anything. I need you to understand this. The man you pulled over wasn't a public figure. He's the axis around which this system has tried not to slip back into an era where black men couldn't sit in the front row. Rick bowed his head, not in guilt, but in recognition that every skill, instinct, or protocol he might once have defended himself with now lay like a soaked rag on marble. Ellis continued, The person who called me this morning was the Deputy State Attorney General. They didn't ask why this happened. They asked, what are you doing to preserve even a sliver of public trust? And I had no answer. Rick stayed silent. In his mind, Ellis's words struck like mallets against the honor he thought was immune to cracking. We were taught not to let emotion interfere with procedure, Ellis said slowly, but no one ever taught us that sometimes, even when the procedure is followed, the outcome can still be morally wrong. The phone on the table rang. Ellis picked it up. Yes, another yes, then he turned to Rick. They want you temporarily off assignment. Within 48 hours, a representative from the State Department of Justice will meet with you in person. Rick stiffened. Suspension? No, but pulled from traffic detail. You'll move to records. No public contact. Rick nodded, lips pressed tight, as if he'd bitten down on a cord that now coiled around his neck. He didn't protest. Because he knew, given everything, this wasn't punishment. It was the system trying to separate him from his collapse. At that very moment, in the State Justice Office, 3 policy advisors were reviewing Judge Gaines's file. A young man, ink still smudged on his hand from a morning presentation, quietly read the first line aloud. Franklin Othell Gaines, born 1950, appointed State Supreme Court Justice in 1998. Chaired the Federal Civil Procedure Reform Subcommittee, declined 3 Senate nominations to retain his state bench. The woman next to him nodded, then said softly, "He never needed fame, he just needed not to be mistaken." Her words drifted through the marble hallways, echoing like a quiet spell. Every office door seemed to close a little slower, as if the walls themselves were trying to pause, to listen, to a truth they had never made time to hear. The door to the Monroe Police Department's conference room closed behind Rick, like a period placed on the wrong line of an unfinished verdict. He didn't look back. He didn't try to explain. Silence had shifted from a shield to a sentence, and Rick, though not fully accepting it, was beginning to understand. Some silences aren't pauses. They're the system's final act of refusing to defend what it knows is wrong. At his new desk in the records office, there were no arrest files, no radio, just a computer screen and a calendar of front desk scheduling. Rick sat there, his shoulders slumped, like a guard reassigned mid-storm without a raincoat. Meanwhile, across the state, an academic symposium at Jackson Law School, planned months in advance, abruptly changed its focus. Justice in Everyday Action was replaced with a simpler title, Franklin O. Gaines, A Forgotten Standard. There was no keynote address, no guest of honor, only a series of video clips, footage from the 1990s, showing Gaines as a community lawyer, standing in run-down civil courtrooms, quoting torn-up law books from memory, each clause and interpretation later codified into state curricula. A silver-haired professor, once his research assistant in the early 2000s, stood in a packed auditorium and said, we used to seat him in the back rows at conferences, because he didn't speak up, didn't show his face. But he was the one writing the appeals that saved hundreds from unjust sentences. Maybe we confused silence with absence. That line spread like a secret language, quoted by news outlets and repackaged as a headline. He didn't need to be remembered. He just needed not to be forgotten. And all the while, Gaines, the center of every headline, every roundtable, every emergency meeting, remained silent. He issued no statement, appeared on no camera, declined every interview. Instead, he continued his routine at the regional legal office, where he still reviewed clemency petitions weekly. When asked about the incident, he told a clerk only this, "If I had to explain why I'm silent, then perhaps I've already said too much." And just like that, he became a symbol, not for rebellion, but for how order itself could be questioned without needing to be broken. 1 week later, the Federal Law Review published a special feature, Franklin O. Gaines and the Cases That Never Made Headlines. The article listed 14 key rulings he had shaped, from overturning a wrongful death penalty conviction in Louisiana to crafting legal arguments that forced Mississippi to revise its entire internal discrimination investigation policy. But what stood out wasn't the legal victories. It was that none were accompanied by press conferences, camera crews, or speeches. He won, then walked away, as if the result was enough, as if society should remember on its own. Rick read the article at his desk, slowly, not to understand every word, but because each sentence felt like a cut across the idealism he once wore when entering this profession, that justice could be carried out as long as one followed the manual. But Gaines didn't follow the manual. He wrote the framework, and that truth alone pushed Rick outside the boundary he once believed was impenetrable. That evening, on a nationally broadcast roundtable, a veteran journalist who had interviewed 3 U.S. presidents was asked, "What do you think about the Monroe incident?" He set down his teacup and said softly, "I don't think this was a personal error. I think it's society being forced to confront this question. If someone like Gaines can be stopped, then how long ago did we drift from our foundation?" No one answered. But by the next morning, the question had spread across forums, schools, and boardrooms, and became the first question that a system once proud to call itself the pillar of justice was finally forced to ask itself. If Franklin O. Gaines was a mirror forcing society to confront itself, then Rick Delroy was beginning to resemble a cracked pane of glass, one where gazes no longer passed through but caught and warped, reflecting the blurred remnants of what was once ignored, excused, or too casually dismissed to examine. When Gaines chose silence, people began to speak. And when they spoke, everything once buried beneath the tidy efficiency of procedural calm began to bleed through, like ink stains on a sealed report. Rick's internal file was ordered for review by an independent oversight panel appointed by the State Department of Justice. No one called it a criminal investigation, but the phrase reassessment of law enforcement conduct under implicit bias metrics was enough for any officer familiar with procedure to recognize the shape of what was coming. The first ripple of a storm no one wanted to be named at the center of. Rick knew, and so did those who had worked beside him. Over the years, he'd been praised as the officer with the highest anomaly detection rate, a euphemism for more stops, faster searches, fewer written records. And once, that was considered a mark of decisiveness. Now, every stop Rick had made was being re-examined through a different lens, the lens of chosen targets. A middle-aged black man once asked to pop his trunk because of a suspicious odor while delivering food to a church group appeared on a TV segment, eyes steady on the camera. I didn't argue. I thought I was just unlucky. Turns out, I was one of many who got called the wrong name. A young woman, only 18 at the time, detained for 30 minutes because she was driving a car too nice for her income records, now a law student, stood at a university legal forum and said, "If I had pushed back that day, maybe I wouldn't have lived to study the rights they denied me." The media didn't sensationalize. They peeled back layers. One local paper published a 3,000-word expose titled High Detection Rate, or High Bias Selection, comparing data from over 30 officers at Rick's rank. It revealed that Rick stopped people of color at 3.4 times the department average. Yet his actual violation rate was significantly lower. The article closed with a question that didn't accuse Rick directly, but skewered the institution that once applauded him. Did we mistake sharp justice for a sheath that allowed bias to swing under the name of law? Even Rick's former peers began to drift. One shift partner, once considered his closest ally, spoke anonymously to a reporter and said, "I used to think Rick was brave because he acted. Now I wonder if he just never had anyone ask him to stop and look." That line spread, not as condemnation but as a quietly painful realization that someone you once trusted might have been the silent replica of something far larger and far more broken than either of you knew. Rick offered no statements, no press appearances. He came to work on time, left on time, but each step through the halls now felt like walking through a mirrored corridor, where nothing was said but every glance had changed, and what kept him awake wasn't what people said. It was what they no longer said when he entered the room. Beneath the surface, the special review team began unsealing cases previously marked insufficient evidence. Several of Rick's traffic stops, hastily recorded, were found to have missing body cam footage, despite departmental policy. Some radio transmissions had audio gaps at key moments. Among them were complaints once dismissed for lacking verifiable proof of discriminatory conduct. Now, those old handwritten forms, shaky script, faded ink, sometimes scribbled by elderly hands, were being reread. And this time, they were not shrugged off. They were treated as fresh evidence of a system that had, for too long, trained itself to look away. Rick sat in his car one cloudy afternoon, engine off, lights out. He stared out at the street. Kids on bikes weaving past, pedestrians walking briskly without so much as glancing at the parked cruiser. Not out of fear, but familiarity. But to Rick, their eyes no longer conveyed recognition. They carried another kind of silence. The silence of those who now knew more, understood better, and chose not to speak. Not out of indifference, but because they were waiting to see if the man in the mirror could finally face what he had spent years not seeing. Rick Delroy was no longer the only name being spoken, and in a strange, ironic way, the laser focus on him had briefly given others a false sense of safety, at least during the first few days of the storm named Franklin O. Gaines. But silence carries its pressure, and in a society beginning to relearn that justice is not a stack of codes, but a living presence, what was once dismissed as not serious enough to investigate quickly became the center of an inquiry that had no formal launch, yet drew everyone in. This time, they weren't asking Rick, they were asking who already knew, and why did they let it continue? These questions didn't need to be called for. They spread on their own like oil across polished tile, quiet, steady, and by the time anyone noticed, the surface was already too slick to deny. An independent newsroom published a series titled Messages Never Sent, exposing dozens of leaked internal emails from the Monroe Police Department. In them, conversations among mid-level commanders from 3 years earlier were crystal clear. Delroy tends to react a bit fast with black folks, but results haven't been bad. Another read, let's not intervene unless there's a formal complaint. Scrubbing data would tank our numbers. No exclamations, no malice, just the cold razor edge of bureaucratic convenience. Cutting not skin, but ethics. The phrase administrative accomplice soon flooded social media. It wasn't just clips of traffic stops being shared anymore. Citizens began digging deeper through payroll records, assignment logs, and monthly meeting notes. Documents once seen as dry and irrelevant were now presented as quiet evidence of a louder guilt. In blurry snapshots, the public didn't just see officers on the street. They saw HR managers signing off on the monitor list of employees, office chatter at the water cooler. Monthly award boards hang neatly above the names of those once flagged for biased conduct and then quietly ignored as if it had been a typo. A new hashtag exploded overnight. Signed and silent. Memos. Internal flags. Even cautionary emails from legal advisors. Warning to use discretion in target profiling surface, shared by staff who once believed they were just cogs, not decision-makers. One internal memo from 2021, resurfaced by a former employee who'd left after a labor suit, showed Rick's superior had been warned by Internal Affairs, monitor Delroy closely. Indications of racially skewed target selection recommendation reassigned to a non-public role. No one signed off. No one forwarded it. It sat in the legal chief's draft folder for 2 years, like a wound covered by office paper. When asked in a closed-door interview why he never acted, that legal chief simply said, "I thought someone else would handle it." The phrase, once leaked, spread like a final verdict needing no jury. A remix video of the quote looped under a somber soundtrack hit 5 million views in just 2 days, and no one could defend thought someone else would any. It became the most damning thing the system had ever said about itself. A rushed survey by the Law Enforcement Administrative Guild followed the fallout. 72% of staff admitted they had heard or suspected signs of misconduct, but did not feel authorized to speak up. When published, it only deepened the outrage. No one believed this was about a few bad actors anymore. A meme went viral, a cracked concrete wall with the caption, "No one broke it," but everyone saw the crack and walked past it. Rick was no longer at the center. He'd been pulled out of the orbit of public outrage, not because he'd been absolved, but because the spotlight had widened. People had begun to see what was bigger than him, the system that created and sustained someone like him for nearly a decade and never once demanded anyone look closely. The Federal Observer ran its front-page headline, "Silence is no longer neutral, it's a choice." The article listed 35 cases like Rick's over 5 years. The number of individuals were disciplined for bias-based enforcement, 2. Not 35, not even 15, just 2. It spread like wildfire. No campaign needed, no commentary required. Just numbers, cold as indictments. The article's final line shook the system at its core. Not everyone who acts wrongly is a villain, but anyone who stays silent in the face of it is surely not innocent. At Monroe PD, a closed-door meeting was called. No cameras, no transcripts, but one veteran officer stood up, voice slicing through the room like a blow to a badge long tarnished. "I sent 2 emails. I knew Delroy had issues, but I didn't want to lose my peer review score. That's on me." No one objected, no one applauded, just silence, thick as fog, hanging over everything the system once claimed as efficient. And in that moment, those who had known, but chose not to see, began to tremble. Not from fear of punishment, but because, for the first time, they understood. Some doors they once thought would open to elevate them had closed forever, not because someone locked them, but because no one can step through a place they once deliberately refused to look into. His name didn't appear on the agenda. No invitation was sent. There was no special seat reserved, and no official escort at the main entrance. Yet, at the precise start time of the state's special legislative hearing on reforming law enforcement standards, a man in a charcoal coat, holding a plain notebook and a freshly sharpened pencil, walked into the Capitol building with a slow but certain gait, like someone who had walked those halls before, not with his feet, but with the rulings that had silently reshaped the law's contours for nearly 3 decades. Franklin O. Gaines didn't ask for directions. He didn't check the seating chart or consult the reception desk. He simply walked forward, past the front rows where senior officials murmured about the Monroe crisis, turned left down the stone-tiled hallway, and sat at the edge of the 5th row from the back, beside the emergency exit. It wasn't a seat for honored guests. It wasn't reserved for the press. But within minutes, no one in the room dared suggest he didn't belong. From the moment Gaines entered, the air inside the chamber shifted, without a word needing to be spoken. Conversations dimmed. Lawmakers reviewing their talking points paused mid-sentence. Glancing toward the back, where he flipped through his notebook with the steady rhythm of a clock, unbothered by urgency. It wasn't because he was famous, nor was it fear. Everyone in the room simply knew. Some people don't need to speak for the entire chamber to reconsider how they're. No one introduced him when the session opened. But the presiding officer, a man in his 50s with a practiced voice, paused twice unconsciously each time his gaze swept across the row where Gaines sat. Perhaps he sensed he was being watched not by a former judge, but by the conscience of a system that had once vested Gaines with its highest authority and then failed to offer him the most basic courtesy, dignity, from a frontline officer. A young delegate, attending his first state forum, stood up after 2 rounds of polished rhetoric. "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't have data. I don't have a comprehensive reform plan. But I know someone in this room today, someone who once made my father stay in law school because of a single sentence he overheard in a courtroom in 1999. The chamber turned, but Gaines didn't look up. He kept writing, his script neat, deliberate, as if he were documenting a hearing that lacked a judge, but had all the testimonies needed for a verdict of the soul. The room slipped into an unspoken breathlessness. In the press row, a journalist reached to tweet the quote, but froze when the State House livestream screen flashed a caption, "The room turns." One man hasn't spoken, but 42 seated in front straighten their backs, no source, no hashtag, no filter. Yet within 20 minutes, the clip spread to over 60 regional outlets, all using the same eerily identical caption, "Silence needs no statement." Later, a female delegate rose. "I was once a legal clerk in Judge Gaines's office. He never taught me how to win a case. He taught me how not to win, and still keep my honor. And today, seeing him sit in the back row, I realize justice doesn't demand the floor. It only needs to be seen." Her words weren't included in the official minutes, but when the session ended, the line appeared across television tickers nationwide, not as a quote, but as a question. Since when did we let a Supreme Court judge sit in the back and feel like we were the ones on trial? The moment the speech hit social media, law students at Northwestern University printed the quote on the backs of their class shirts. No logos, no colors, just white letters on black cotton. Justice doesn't need to speak. It just needs to be seen. The next day, during a campus dialogue on ethics and legislation, nearly half the attendees wore matching shirts. No one told them to. No one organized it, but when cameras rolled, attention turned, not toward the panel, but to the silent crowd, to the message not spoken, but worn between the shoulder blades. Gaines said nothing throughout the 3-hour hearing. No nods, no frowns, no visible agreement or dissent, but one moment was caught on a rear camera. When a young lawyer stood to challenge a procedural proposal, Gaines's gaze lifted, meeting her, and she sat back down. No one knew why. When asked later, she simply replied, "I didn't want to be the one defending what I didn't believe in front of a man who never had to stand to prove he was right." The pencil continued its steady scribble. Short, fragmented notes no one would ever read. When the hearing adjourned, Gaines rose, closed his notebook, and exited without anyone stopping him, without anyone inviting him to stay. But as the door clicked shut behind him, the chair turned to the room and spoke, not with finality, but with the weight of a truth long overdue. "I don't know how much of what we discuss today will become policy, but I do know this. Someone sat at the back and made this entire room start looking backward, for the first time in a long time." Franklin O. Gaines left the legislative chamber the same way he entered, without a word, without asking for anyone's gaze to follow him. But behind him he left a room full of people who, whether they noticed it or not, had adjusted their posture as they sat, not because he said anything powerful, but because he chose not to say anything else. And in that restraint, every justification that followed rang like the echo of something no longer appropriate for the moment. Rick Delroy, meanwhile, sat miles away in a small recording room at a local television station, 2 towns over. No audience, no media coordinator, just a young producer adjusting the sound levels and checking the camera's sharpness, like this was merely a filing clip for a forgotten archive. "You ready?" the young woman asked without pretense. Rick nodded, not with the readiness of someone eager to speak, but with the quiet surrender of a man who understood that if he didn't say something now, then anything he said later wouldn't matter, not even his silence. Just before the camera rolled, Rick had glanced at a scrolling news ticker on the waiting screen. 3 students in another state refused to complete their civics homework, questioning whether a good citizen is someone who follows the law even when it harms others. No one mentioned Gaines, but Rick knew exactly where that question had come from, and he understood remaining silent would be complicity. The camera light turned red. No opening graphics, no music, just a flat, unfiltered frame. Rick in a faded blue shirt, no epaulets, no nameplate, no trace of the man who once held the power to halt a life with a single stop sign. "I used to think I was doing the right thing," Rick said slowly, his eyes not looking into the lens but fixed somewhere off-screen, perhaps picturing Gaines's face. "I followed protocol. I used the language I was trained in. I filed the right reports. And I carried with me this belief that if I didn't let emotion interfere, then I was a good cop." He paused. No transitions, no edits, just a silence long enough to make the viewer uncomfortable, to force them to listen. Outside the booth, the technician peeking through the glass quietly turned away. Not out of emotion, but because some confessions aren't loud and still make it impossible to sit through them entirely. "But then I realize," Rick continued, his voice quieter now, "there are moments when not letting emotion in is the problem. Because emotion is what lets you see someone as human, not just as a subject. And I didn't do that." For the first time, he looked directly at the camera, not with apology, not in defense, but like someone delivering a crime scene report. Except the crime scene was his interior. I stopped him, because I couldn't reconcile the man and the car, the face and the way he looked at the road. His calmness didn't match the unspoken expectations I'd been trained to question in anyone who didn't seem nervous enough. He stressed unspoken expectations as if trying to carve the phrase into his memory more than anyone else's. Behind the lens, the producer squinted, sensing that what sounded like calm was a dissection of someone who had just realized they'd been both perpetrator and evidence. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten, I didn't use force, but I placed him in a situation I could never have placed myself in, and that's the terrifying part. He didn't wipe his face, didn't bow his head, just rested his hands flat on his thighs, like a man trying to balance on a chair with one leg gone. A light sound in the hallway, security folding up chairs from an earlier staff meeting, caused Rick to glance at the door. The only moment he broke from his train of thought, and the exact moment future viewers, when watching the tape, collectively stopped breathing, not because of a dramatic act, but because they sensed this was a moment that couldn't be recreated, not even to apologize. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said, "because I don't deserve it." The line wasn't scripted, not in the notes, but the producer didn't cut. She knew it didn't need cutting. "I only hope for one thing, that those who come into this profession after me don't believe they can act without empathy and still call it justice." He sat still, said nothing else. The producer gave a small nod. "I think," Rick replied, "it's not enough, but I don't know what else to say." The video lasted 4 minutes and 32 seconds. No overlays, no edits, no hashtags when it aired. Yet within 3 days, over a dozen law schools, judicial training centers, and police academies had requested the raw file, not to broadcast, but to teach. In a modest classroom in Northern California, a professor paused the projector and turned to the students. "Do you think he feels remorse?" One student said. "No." The professor nodded. "Neither do I. But we don't need him to feel sorry. We just need him to have the courage not to lie about what he did." And the class didn't write anything down. They just stood up and walked out in silence. After Rick Delroy's confession aired, no banners were unfurled, no marches were organized, no hashtags trended. But that didn't mean society stayed quiet. It had merely begun to resist in ways that needed no labels, like a tide with no crashing waves, strong enough to wash away everything once held together by willful blindness. At a high school in Tennessee, during roll call, a teacher mispronounced the name of a black student. something that happened all too often, but this time no one laughed. No one corrected her, no one stood, the student didn't flinch. He simply bowed his head and wrote in his notebook, "I am not your mispronunciation." A classmate took a photo, no caption. But that image was shared over 100,000 times in 3 days. No one asked the boy's name. They just posted, "He doesn't need to be called right. He just needs not to be called wrong." Again, in a quiet coastal town in Oregon, tiny plastic fedoras began appearing on license plates. Not sun hats, but 3D printed replicas of the hat Gaines wore in the now famous video. No one sold them officially, no movement advertised them, yet souvenir shops ran out of the mini hats as residents printed their own and attached them to the lower corner of their plates. Soft-spoken symbols saying, "I saw it, I will not look away." At a local courthouse in Nebraska, clerks no longer asked, "What's your name?" when someone approached the counter. Instead, they said, "What would you like me to call you properly?" It wasn't a procedural revolution, but for those who had spent a lifetime being misnamed, it was the first time the system adjusted itself, not to correct them, but to acknowledge they were never the error. Meanwhile, in a law school classroom in Chicago, a professor played a silent video, the clip of Gaines sitting quietly in the back row during the legislative hearing. Write an essay, she instructed, on how a person can change a room without speaking. No further directions. The class fell silent, writing not for grades, but as a way of making sure they didn't ignore what needed remembering. In a small New York cafe, a handwritten sign hung above the counter. "We don't serve by table numbers, we serve by calling your name correctly." Below it, a drawing of a notebook in pencil, the silent emblems of Gaines. No logo, no signature, but anyone who'd seen the clip understood. It was the owner's way of saying, "We remember." Even within law enforcement, a place often immune to nuance, quiet shifts began to ripple. A lieutenant in Minneapolis updated night shift protocols. Before you fill out a citation, ask, "Can I confirm the spelling of your name so I don't get it wrong?" A small gesture, one that didn't slow operations, but it forced officers to pause, to remember they were writing about people, not just case numbers. That seemingly innocuous question triggered a chain reaction. At the Des Moines precinct, an elderly man wept when asked how to correctly spell his name. His citation had listed his deceased son's name. Same surname, same birthday. The mistake wasn't malicious. But the pain was real. The shift commander moved, hand-wrote a policy memo, his first since promotion. From now on, never let someone's name be mistaken for the one they lost. In Chicago, a precinct supervisor began requiring officers to submit personal reflections after filing reports. Not to evaluate feeling, but to remind them that law enforcement records don't just document others' errors, they expose our moral footprints too. One rookie officer wrote, "I'm not sure I'm detached enough to write objectively when they look at me like they're about to disappear." The line wasn't bolded, not underlined, but the supervisor read it aloud at a team meeting before folding the page and saying, "We won't file another report unless we know who we're writing about and why." Rick Delroy learned of these changes, not through headlines. He had long stopped reading the news, but through the eyes of people he passed on the street, no longer in uniform. They no longer looked at him like a threat, but they didn't look at him like someone they trusted either. They looked at him the way you look at an old ink stain on a clean sheet. Not big enough to tear the page, but enough that no one would dare write on it again. Once, he walked into his old cafe, the one where the owner used to offer a free drink to those who kept the peace. No one kicked him out, but as he stood waiting, the barista didn't meet his eyes, didn't ask if he wanted to use his loyalty card, though the worn card still sat in his wallet, its edges frayed from years of use. When it was his turn, Rick ordered the usual. The barista said nothing, just nodded and scribbled on the cup, "Wishing you a peaceful day." No name, just a phrase reserved for those quietly trying to move through something too painful to name. And Franklin O. Gaines, the man whose silence had stirred all of this, still granted no interviews. He didn't write a memoir. He accepted no speaking engagements. He refused to allow his name to be used in any campaign. But that didn't stop people from mentioning him. Not by name, but in ways no system could suppress. By sitting in the last row instead of standing at the podium. By bringing a notebook instead of a speech. By reminding others that sometimes the only form of resistance left, it's making sure the worst doesn't happen again. Not one more time, not in silence. The tiny fedora on car license plates was no longer an oddity. It appeared in hospital parking lots, outside police precincts, among teachers' cars and school lots. No one mandated it, no campaign launched it, and yet a generation seemed quietly intent on replacing the rituals they once took for granted with gestures that finally called things by their rightful names. A beginning. In a small classroom at Maplewood Elementary in Illinois, the teacher wrote 2 words on the board, "Good citizen." It was meant to follow the usual Wednesday lesson plan, obey laws, respect others, keep promises. But that day didn't follow the plan. Just as she underlined the word respect, a small hand rose, deliberate, not rushed. "Miss," a boy asked, "if someone follows the rules but hurts other people, are they still a good citizen?" The room went silent. No laughter, no fidgeting. No eyes looked away from their desks. The question wasn't in the curriculum. No textbook had the answer, no side note offered examples, and no study guide listed it as test prep. Yet it was the question every child, and the adult at the front, knew. If they couldn't answer it today, every chapter that followed would be meaningless. The teacher paused, eyes meeting the boys, then glanced at his clenched hands gripping the desk as if he too wasn't sure if he had the right to ask such a thing. Then she nodded, stepped back to her desk, tore a blank sheet of paper, and wrote 3 words. Hurt, but legal. She taped it to the board, replacing the lesson slide. This is what we'll talk about today, maybe all week. Outside the class, the principal, walking the hall, overheard a snippet of the question as students began their discussion. He stopped, said nothing. But back at his office, he sent an email to the entire faculty. If today any other class teaches the same way as yesterday, don't call this a school. The message leaked within hours, sparking a wave across educational forums. Not for its progressive tone, but because a school leader had issued a directive grounded not in policy, but in conscience. That day, Maplewood's civics class had no quizzes, no roll call, and no homework, just 30 minutes of quiet as students wrote on one sheet of paper, "If I make someone sad but don't get in trouble, does that mean I'm right? If grown-ups do wrong but the law says it's okay, should I grow up like them or like what's good? Why does justice need a video to be believed?" A local police officer and parent visited the teacher the next morning after his child came home asking, "Dad, have you ever scared someone and not been punished?" The teacher gave no defense. She showed him the handwritten student questions. He said nothing. A week later, he sent a formal request to revise the town's officer training curriculum. Asked why, he simply wrote, "I once believed I was a good man. Now I just want my kid to never doubt that." Soon after, a publishing house posted one of the children's pages on social media, a shaky pencil-written question on wrinkled paper. If the right thing makes people quiet, is it still right? No caption, no hashtags, no school or class name. But in 24 hours it was shared over 700,000 times, mostly by teachers, doctors, lawyers, people whose lives revolve around giving answers, but now stopped cold by a child's question. The questions were archived in Maplewood's mailbox. Weeks later, they were compiled and sent to a National Education Council, which adopted them as official training material for upcoming teacher development programs. No news crews came, no cameras, no stages, but full scans of the children's handwritten notes were published unedited on the websites of 3 major newspapers. No formatting, no commentary, no title, just a simple line. They didn't ask about Mr. Gaines, but he is the reason these questions exist. Within 48 hours, the jagged letters of young children sparked a storm online. A 30-second video, shot secretly from outside the Maplewood classroom, showed the teacher reading a note aloud. "If I follow the rules and the other person still cries, whose fault is that?" The clip was viewed over 2 million times. No one asked who wrote it, but thousands of users changed their profile photos to a blank sheet of paper, a symbol of questions that don't need answers, but demand a pause. Soon, schools across the country began dedicating a monthly period called Unwritten Questions. Not graded, not mandatory, but no teacher was allowed to ignore them. Not to solve, but to remind children some truths don't live in multiple choice. They live in whether the person across from you still feels seen as human. A Michigan public school held its first unwritten question session with over 200 students. Administrators expected a few generic prompts, but when a third grader stood up, voice shaking, and asked, "If I see someone get blamed unfairly and my teacher says nothing, should I stay quiet when I grow up?" The faculty didn't answer. They revised the staff handbook instead, for the first time in 20 years, because it was the adults with credentials, tenure, and experience who couldn't answer a child's question. In Texas, a group of parents protested the program, fearing it sowed doubt in traditional values. But when a second-grade girl, daughter of a police officer, told local TV, "My dad doesn't just ask me how many points I scored, he asks if I saw anyone treated badly today," the backlash evaporated. Within 3 days, the number of schools joining the initiative quadrupled, not for policy, but because too many children now knew how to ask what adults no longer dared to face. Maplewood's story surfaced during a statewide curriculum reform summit. A veteran professor who once opposed social context in legal education stood and admitted, "I once believed the law was enough to guide behavior. I was wrong. The law helps people avoid wrongdoing, but only morality keeps them from hurting others, even when the law says they can." The media didn't quote his speech, but a first-year law student recorded it on their phone and posted it online with the note, "I saved this to remember the day someone brave enough changed the definition they'd taught all their life." The clip, just 80 seconds, no filter, no music, became the most played video in ethics classes the following semester. Even those who'd never cared about civics now watched it, because they, too, had once been wrong, legally, but wrongly. The quote was reshared again and again, paired with a photo, small hands holding a worn pencil, beneath a scribbled line, "I don't need a law to know what hurts someone." At the legal office, where Gaines still showed up weekly, a new paper mailbox sat at reception, not for legal documents, but for handwritten letters from elementary students around the country. Some were just one-liners, "I know who you are, and I want to grow up not hurting anyone without someone stopping me." No envelopes, no return address, no expectation of a reply, because writing it down was already being heard. When the mailbox at the law office where Mr. Gaines worked began filling up with letters from anonymous senders, it was also the moment Rick Delroy received notice that his son had requested 2 days off from school, citing the reason, "I don't want to go to class with a name that everyone keeps talking about during recess." There was nothing unusual about the message, except one thing. It was sent from Rick's phone. His son had logged into the family account and filled out the form himself. Not to skip school, but to avoid facing an image he once thought was as solid as a house foundation, only to find out it was just a picture, built from the trust of a child. That message arrived just as Rick stepped out of an internal meeting where his superiors had introduced a new regulation. All officers previously reported for discriminatory behavior were required to attend a law enforcement ethics retraining course and record a self-evaluation video to be filed in their records. A colleague had whispered, "Do you think anyone wants to watch their face as they admit to something they once denied?" Rick didn't respond. He just walked out of the room in silence. But in his mind, his son's message echoed like a voice down a dark, unlit hallway. Rick read the message while standing in the parking lot after hours, his shirt already wrinkled from a day of uneasy movements, just like how his posture no longer fit the shape he once inhabited. He didn't call back, didn't text, just drove straight home, where once, whenever he knocked, his son would come running out with the usual question, "Did you catch anyone today, Dad?" Now, the door opened, and no one waited. Rick's footsteps echoed through the house like those of a stranger. On the dining table lay a notebook from civics class, the corner folded. As Rick reached to put it away, he noticed a page, outlined in red, containing a student-written paragraph. What would you do if someone who once made you feel safe later made others afraid? No name, no specific lesson. But the slanted handwriting leaned slightly to the left, just like his son's. Rick froze, his hand resting on the cover, as if afraid he was touching the evidence of something that could never be undone. The boy sat in the living room, TV off, phone untouched. Hugging a pillow, eyes cast to the floor as if the answers he wasn't ready to ask were buried right there. Rick sat down across from him. Not far, but the silence between them stretched wide enough for all excuses to fall into and never return. "Have you read the news?" Rick asked, but the question wasn't meant for information. It was a small hope that maybe the boy hadn't seen it all. But his son looked up, not with blame, not with tears, just a gaze that passed through like wind through curtains. "Yes, but I didn't need the news to know." He reached behind him and pulled out a crumpled sheet of paper, a printout from social media. Bold headline, "Elderly black man ordered to raise his hands by Officer Rick Delroy for security reasons." Rick recognized that photo. He once thought it was just a procedural stop, but in the frame, the old man's eyes weren't looking at the camera. They were looking straight at Rick, as if asking, "Is this what you used to call protection?" The boy said nothing more, just left the paper on the table and turned away. Rick wanted to burn it, but his hands trembled, not from fear, but from realizing that fire couldn't destroy what had already been misplaced in his son's memory. Rick clenched both hands, not from tension, but as a reflex from years of holding firm during hearings. But this time, no one was asking. Only one line from the boy, soft as a paper cut. "You used to tell me a good person is someone who doesn't make others afraid when they walk into a room. So why did that man have to stand like that in front of your car?" That question wasn't covered in any training Rick had taken. It didn't need legal references. It didn't call for procedural justification. It required something Rick no longer had. The integrity once reflected in the eyes of the person who believed in him the most. He bowed his head, but not low enough to hide the fracture forming in his chest. "I didn't think I was doing anything wrong." Back then, the words escaped like a confession, not asking for forgiveness, just trying to locate himself again within a memory that was draining every excuse dry. The air between father and son thickened, not from crying, but from the vacuum left between lost trust and something that couldn't be named. On the table sat the files Rick had brought home from the department, not yet stashed away. The boy glanced at them and spotted the name Gaines highlighted in red in an internal report Rick once wrote, now crumpled but not erased. "You once wrote that he disrupted protocol," the boy whispered. Not as an accusation, but like someone trying to recheck reality. Rick stiffened. That wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. He had read it, and remembered every word. Rick's son didn't react immediately. He just nodded. But the nod wasn't an agreement. It was the closure of a chapter he once believed would be continued with better acts. with righteous behavior, modeled after someone he now had to let go of. "You don't have to explain it to me, Dad," the boy said, his voice neither raised nor cold, just steady like the heartbeat of someone who had just run through a shock. "I know you used to be good at your job, but I also know that sometimes doing a good job doesn't mean doing the right thing." Rick wanted to argue, to say that in every case he followed the rules, but his mouth didn't open, because just then the boy's phone lit up with a viral video, a clip from a student council meeting where a kid stood up and said, "We learn about justice from the man who pulled over my dad. But I learned about ethics when I saw my father couldn't look me in the eye at dinner." The room had gone silent. No one needed names, but Rick knew. That was the son of a former colleague, and now his child sat in that same kind of silence. Rick tried to say something, but the familiar words, justice, ethics, profession, now sounded like echoes from a landslide. No resonance. No authority. The boy stood up and walked to his room. No slamming, no tears, no shouting. Just closed the door the way someone folds a page from a book gone wrong. Not torn, not burned, but never to be reopened. Down the hall, Rick still heard the slow turn of the bedroom lock. Not loud, but loud enough to change how he walked to the kitchen. An evening like any other, but every detail now felt like a faded replica of a home once believed to hold a father worth admiring. In the corner of the fridge, a drawing the boy once made of both of them in police uniforms, the childish strokes above the words, "When I grow up, I'll be like Dad," was now smudged, one corner stained from a warped door. Rick pulled the paper out, but couldn't bring himself to throw it away. He just folded it in half and tucked it into the bottom drawer, where he had once kept his firearm during his early years on the force, now sealed away like something no longer meant to be used again. Rick sat there, alone, not as a suspended officer, not as a citizen facing public backlash, but as a father who had just lost the most important role no tribunal could ever restore, the image of a role model in his son's eyes. And that moment, without cameras, without transcripts, without a statement, was the most excruciating verdict Rick had ever endured, because for the first time, the one delivering the judgment was the child who once thought he wanted to grow up to be just like Dad. Rick Delroy sat by the living room window, sunlight cutting across the porch, casting a faint beam onto the sleeve of his faded shirt. Behind his son's closed door, the silence was no longer defiance, it was distance. No shouting, no dramatic fallout, but more definitive than any official reprimand he'd ever signed. And at that very moment, across the state, Franklin O. Gaines was quietly stepping onto the stairs leading into the Northwind University Conference Center, where a large banner had just been hung, celebrating 30 years of U.S. law and justice reform, honoring those who laid the first stone. No one was surprised to see his name on the guest list, but everyone was surprised he showed up. For nearly 4 months, Mr. Gaines had made no public statements, declined interviews, and ignored invitations from law schools and conferences alike. He moved through society like a sentient still life, appearing at the right moment, in the right place, forcing everyone around him to recalibrate their gaze. And today, when he walked into the auditorium, his fedora tilted just as always, a pencil neatly tucked into the chest pocket of his worn shirt, the entire room seemed to lower its volume instinctively. Row after row leaned slightly forward, not out of curiosity, but as if everyone simultaneously recognized that being present here was one thing, but maintaining inner stillness in his presence was something else entirely. Inside, a group of federal leaders had previously agreed that if he declined to speak, the program would transition directly to the commemorative award segment as a silent tribute. But within just 10 minutes of his arrival, that segment was canceled, because his mere presence had made the notion of giving anything feel so redundant it bordered on disrespect. He didn't approach the podium right away. Even after his name had been read aloud during the introductions, even after the MC invited him up 3 times. He simply stood in the third row, one hand resting on the chair in front of him, his eyes fixed on the words hanging above the stage. Reform doesn't begin with the system. It begins when the system learns to listen. That phrase had circulated widely on social media, been printed on T-shirts, engraved on ID cards by NGO, but no one had ever seen him stand beneath it. The atmosphere sank into stillness as his gaze landed on a man seated in the front row, a politician who just a year ago had publicly claimed this isn't a systemic issue, it's an emotional overreaction. The man's face went pale, not from fear, but from realizing, for the first time since his election, that a look from someone without title or rank could strip away the illusion that everything is fine. Then, after a full minute of silence, Gaines slowly stepped toward the podium, not via the main stairs but by circling in from a side path, forcing every eye in the room to pivot in his direction. A live stream camera from a regional station wobbled slightly. The reporter behind it had held their breath too long. On Twitter, within 4 minutes, over 50,000 viewers watching the broadcast simultaneously posted the same symbol. A dash, no hashtags, no commentary. Just a mark of silence that everyone understood was swelling inside a room full of people who usually spoke. The microphone was already on, the recording equipment had been activated, the coordinator had even prepared a backup script in case he didn't speak. But he did, just one sentence. No paper, no booming voice. He simply lifted his head, scanned the auditorium, and asked, "At this point, who among you still believes that 'I didn't know' is an acceptable answer?" The question didn't carry rage, nor was it accusatory. But it rang out like a tap on a bell of conscience, not loud, yet impossible to pretend one hadn't heard it. 1 second, 2, then 10. The entire room went silent. No one bowed their heads, no one looked around. They looked at him not for a follow-up, but to confront themselves. Because that question wasn't meant to be answered. It only needed to live long enough in memory so that future decisions had no room left for organized ignorance. Gaines didn't wait for applause. He didn't bow. He simply stepped off the podium, exiting down a narrow corridor where natural light filtered through slats of glass like words that had never been spoken in closed-door meetings. Someone thought of calling him back, but no one did, because deep down each person in that hall understood. If you have to ask again, it means you're not yet ready to hear the real answer. After that event, there was no viral clip, no clickbait headlines, just one brief quote quietly shared across legal forums. Franklin O. Gaines, no speech, no bouquet, just one question, and he left, like a verdict that didn't need a stamp. A law school in Massachusetts printed that sentence on the back cover of its graduation folders this year. No explanation. No footnote. No one felt the need. At a small police station in central Kentucky, the newly promoted captain, after his predecessor took early retirement, pinned a note on the internal bulletin board. It read, "From now on, any report stating, 'I didn't know,' must include an explanation for why you didn't try to know." It wasn't an order. It wasn't a threat, but it was the first thing that made the entire night shift sit down together in a meeting longer than usual, not to discuss stats, but to redefine something they thought they understood. Knowing is a responsibility, not a privilege. Since the Northwind Conference, where Franklin O. Gaines posed a question the system still has not dared to answer directly, no one has spoken of him the way they used to. The newspapers that once dedicated their front pages to images of him standing silently in the hall have stopped their coverage. Special interview programs no longer list him among future guests. His name no longer scrolls across the morning news ticker, appears in hashtags tied to new incidents, features in award nominations, or real-world-inspired law courses. And yet, curiously, and this is the one thing that continues to baffle those in the media, his presence has never really faded. At a police department in Wisconsin, they removed the identifying characteristics section from their traffic stop forms and replaced it with a single question: did the individual feel discriminated against? The question carried no legal binding, but each time it was written, the officer had to look at the person again, not to confirm appearance, but to determine whether they had become the tool of something they once denied existed. In the first week of implementation, a veteran officer who had previously received 3 commendations for swift resolution put down his pen mid-shift, not due to job stress, but because for the first time he was required to write something he could not finish without looking inward and could not afford to get wrong. That story spread, not because of an administrative mandate, but because an internal recording was leaked revealing that the same officer, upon entering the captain's office, had said something that left many unable to sit still. "I'm not sure I've ever made someone feel less than human." That line appeared in no training manual, but it began showing up in chalk on internal bulletin boards, like an unofficial oath, whispered, not declared. At a small university in Carolina, the faculty board decided not to hang Gaines's portrait in the Hall of Honor, not because he didn't deserve it, but because he had handwritten a note declining the tribute. Don't frame a person if what they left behind was a way for others to unframe themselves. In place of a photo, the school mounted a blank whiteboard with no name, no quote, just a surface for students each year to write down one thing they once believed was not important enough to relearn, but now had changed. After 1 year, the board was filled with hundreds of different handwritings. No one suggested erasing it. Each year, in early April, graduating seniors are invited to add another line. But this year, one student, a full scholarship law major, stood in front of the board for nearly 30 minutes without writing anything. When asked why, he simply replied, "Because the sentence I need to write is something I haven't yet dared to change in how I see others." That answer was forwarded by his academic advisor to all faculty members, and from there, the final law exam for that year was changed to, "Have you ever seen someone who was right, but chose not to stand with them? Explain why." There was no correct answer, yet nearly 1/3 of that graduating class left the question blank. And that blank, the one without a mark, was what forced the faculty board to reconvene, not to grade, but to redefine the moral threshold of their entire program. In legal circles, questions without precedent have begun to be referred to as Gainesbeer questions, those moral dilemmas that transcend protocol, requiring the responder to pause, reflect, and act as though no one is watching, because that is when true integrity operates. The term was initially met with resistance by a group of conservative academics who argued that no person's name should be attached to a scenario that could cause someone to fail based on personal moral emotion. But during a closed-door hearing on civil service reform in Illinois, when a senator asked, "So, who would you rather we fail, the one who's not smart enough or the smart one who's missing their humanity?" the room went silent, and from then on, no one contested the name. In the latest round of public service exams, the questions no longer ask, "How would you handle discovering a colleague's misconduct?" but instead, "What would you do if there's no evidence, but your moral compass tells you something is wrong?" And every examiner who sat on that panel knows it's no longer just a test. It's a form of character audit, one that no longer carries a name, but still bears his imprint. At a confidential policy meeting in the Federal Office of Executive Affairs, the air thickened when a new document titled Bias-Free Communication Standards in Law Enforcement was laid on the coordinator's table. No one outright opposed it, but there were exchanged glances, furrowed brows, and one senior supervisor posed a single question. Do we need to formalize emotion? That prompted a high-level investigator, known for his toughness, to set down his pen, look across the table, and say, without pause or raised voice, I once met a man who didn't want to be named, but who made everyone in the room change how they spoke just by standing quietly in a corner. And no one asked further. Not because the man was famous, but because everyone knew exactly whom he meant, without needing it said aloud. The very next morning, a rejection letter arrived from a well-known journalist who had been slated to host a feature series on those who changed the system from within. The letter contained no apology, just one line. I cannot write about this man as a subject, because he's made every subject I've ever written about look inward. The letter was leaked online, triggering fierce debate. Does the press still deserve to tell stories they once chose to ignore? Within 24 hours, dozens of other writers began posting essays on nameless figures, sparking a wave of characterless features, where the focus was no longer the person, but the transformation they triggered in institutions. At a national high school debate tournament, organizers unexpectedly played a wordless video clip of Gaines sitting in the back row of a hearing. The question posed wasn't, was he right or wrong, but how many people in that room failed to see before the media forced them to? A team from Arizona won, not through sharp argument, but by ending their speech with a single gesture. The entire team turned their backs to the audience and stood in silence for 30 seconds. No applause followed. But a judge later wrote in the scoring notes, "This is the first time I've marked a debate speech that needed no words to redefine what compelling means." When a law professor and former federal judicial aide retired, he hosted no farewell party. But in the last drawer of his filing cabinet, he left behind a draft proposal to reform how civil complaints were processed, a document that had been repeatedly rejected for using overly emotional language. This time, he submitted the final version with a handwritten note. I don't need this system to thank me. I just needed to stop forcing anyone else to remain silent. The note was turned into a small printout and posted above the courthouse's main photocopier, the place every legal document passed through, as an informal declaration. Franklin O. Gaines no longer visited the law office weekly. He moved to the suburbs, where mornings were quiet enough to hear the pages of a notebook turning in the breeze. He no longer wrote for anyone, left no notes, registered for no speaking events. Yet people still referred to him, not by name but in phrases like, the one who made me rewrite how I file reports, the one who made me look my student in the eye when reading their name, the one who made me realize that silence is also an answer. At a used bookstore in Kansas, the shop owner placed a wooden chair beside the law section, not for sale, not for sitting. Carved faintly into its backrest, not for the famous, for those who make others rethink. And everyone who visited sat down for a moment, not to read, just to sit, then stood up and left behind a small slip of paper, jotting something they'd never thought they'd say out loud in public. Franklin O. Gaines never asked for anything in his post-career life, but what he left behind is something no one dared to dispute. Not a legacy, not achievements, not titles, but a standard that needs no stamp, no label. A man who no longer needs to be named, because that very absence proves he is no longer a person. He has become a structure of something that should exist in every system, but is often missing. The silence that forces people to speak to themselves. In the outskirts where Franklin O. Gaines chose to end the meetings, the hearings, and all the applause that never needed to happen, there was a nameless road running through a line of eucalyptus trees. Each morning he would walk that path with a folded notebook tucked into his shirt pocket, not to write anything new, but to preserve the shape of an old habit. Locals occasionally caught sight of him, silent as a shadow stretched long by the sun. No one approached for conversation. No one asked for an autograph. And somehow, No one felt the need to refer to him by name anymore. Not because they forgot, but because remembering him in the old way no longer felt necessary. His name no longer appeared on television, not in Person of the Year features, not in annual tributes or justice system year-end reports. But what was strange, what puzzled even the most seasoned media professionals, was that people still behaved differently. In courthouse hallways, at student registration desks, in how a police officer asked someone's name during a stop. No one cited the Gaines case as precedent, but everyone acted as if he'd just been mentioned that morning. In a small town far to the east, inside a classroom no longer teaching from the old syllabus, a boy, when asked about the hero you'd like to become, didn't choose a name. He wrote, "The person I want to be is someone who says nothing, but makes others start saying the right things." The teacher asked again, "Who are you referring to?" The boy answered, "No one. I think it's about the people who start questioning themselves when they are, even when no one is calling them out." That answer didn't make it to the school's honor board, but it was printed, taped to the classroom door for a full year, like a quiet proclamation. Sometimes the greatest lesson isn't an event, but the space it leaves behind. Franklin O. Gaines had no farewell ceremony, no honorary tribute, no late-life medal presentation. When he left his law office for the final time, the secretary found only a notebook left behind, open to a single blank page with one line written at an angle. If it needs to be retold, it hasn't sunk deep enough to live on without mention. The notebook was stored away, not displayed, no QR code, no archival purpose. It simply sat there. Evidence that accused no one but refused to let anyone walk away from the question, how long did we stay silent before one man had to speak for the whole system? In internal reform reports across the judiciary, a new type of chart began to appear, not to measure success, but to track moments when behavior changed due to awareness, not regulation. The chart had no official name, but policy analysts called it a reflection marker, highlighting not events, but the exact moments when a person paused mid-action, realizing that what once passed for justice was no longer seen that way by those on the receiving end. No one needed to mention the Rick Delroy case anymore. No one replayed the old footage. There was no need. What mattered most wasn't in the clip, but in the disappearance of that reflex to lower one's gaze when seeing a police officer. It had been replaced by something else. Eye contact. Not challenging, not fearful, just the gaze of someone who no longer felt beneath the law in conversation. At an end-of-year education summit, a debate arose over whether Mr. Gaines's name should be added to school textbooks. One professor quietly said, "I believe it's better not to." People were surprised. He explained, "Because if students must learn of him from a textbook, it means we've failed to make his actions live in how they're taught every day." The proposal passed. His name did not appear in print. But moral education sessions began to change. No more slogans, only open-ended scenarios, ending with a single question. If you're not wrong but someone else feels harm, should you do it again? Franklin O. Gaines never wanted to rewrite history. He only wanted to prevent it from repeating the same way. And that doesn't require a storyteller. Because if this story had to be told, what it left behind would only be telling, not the thing that needs to change. And for that reason, it does not need to be retold. Thank you for following this story to its final moment. If you feel that what you've just read was more than a headline, if something in it touched a corner of your heart, please don't let it scroll past like just another clip in an endless feed. Pause for a moment. Leave a comment. It doesn't need to be long, it doesn't need to be poetic. Just your honest thoughts. Have you ever been in a similar situation? Have you ever felt your silence was a form of complicity? Or maybe you just want to say, I understand. Each share from you helps us spread meaningful content and creates a space where those who've been silent will see that they are no longer alone. We create these stories not for views, but because we believe telling the right thing, even something small, can change the way someone sees themselves. If you find value in that, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Help us keep telling stories worth telling. Help us keep the fire alive for those voices that people once thought no one wanted to hear. You're helping the truth stay alive, and for us, that's more than enough to keep going.